Hi, my name is Elizabeth Somboun. I am 44 years of age, and today we're going to be talking about my story of sex trafficking, adoption, and the journey to my healing. Things were really chaotic when I was born. My mom had moved in with her aunt and uncle. There was an incest relationship that happened between her uncle and herself that produced me. When she was pregnant, my Aunt Judy, she was murdered in Henrietta, Oklahoma. During that time, her fiance fell in love with my mom. I think Terry was expecting my mom to kind of have the same presence as my Aunt Judy, and that really didn't happen. I think they were together 4 or 5 months prior to him just being nope, I'm done. And then once things had gone downhill, my mom moved back in with my grandmother, and things financially kind of collapsed. For those of you who are familiar with the movie Footloose, it's actually based on the movie Henrietta, Oklahoma. So it was a super religious community, but it's really filled with a lot of domestic violence. The bar is you could drink and stuff, but you still couldn't dance. It's also a sundown town. Once the sun goes down, whites have to stay on their side and African Americans have to stay on their side. And it's still that way today. That hasn't changed very much. The relationship with my mom and her uncle, I know that it was a little bit under the rug, kind of. I think my mom had a lot more shame with it, but I think as far as the rest of the family, it was just whatever, we don't care, it's normal. Incest may not be very well talked about, but I think it's a lot more accepted there than probably in other locations around the United States. It was really hard for myself when I found out about it because I was a completely unwanted child, even from the point of conception. And I remember my mom, she had come into the room and I was sitting on my bed and she looked at me and she said, you're not doing a very good job attaching to your stepfather. And I was well, I don't like him very much. And she's well, I'm not really giving you an option here. He's providing for us, we need the money, you need to do what you need to do to attach. So right after that conversation, I bounced off the bed, my little feet skipped across the floor, and he was watching a TV show, and I bounced up on his lap, very cutely, and I put my arm like this, and he ended up burning me with a cigarette very badly, actually. My mom had to take me to the emergency room. Dr. John Smith told my mom, Linda, I know this was not an accident. This was done on purpose. It's a 3rd-degree burn. I'm not going to turn you in because I delivered her, I delivered you, and I delivered your mom. So, I'm not going to turn you into social services, but I'm going to tell you that I know for a fact that this wasn't accidental, and he sent me back. This is kind of the mentality of we kind of had this in the military for a long time, don't ask, don't tell about sexual orientation, but this kind of mentality is the same with domestic abuse in a lot of these southern small towns. And I think it was just don't ask, don't tell. And even though he went to church and he was a God-fearing man, there was just this element of we're not going to talk about this. It's hard for me because that was kind of my downfall at the moment when I realized that nobody was going to protect me. And then along with poverty comes addiction, and I don't think that people really understand how desperate people can be for this. I ended up becoming curious. My mom, she worked nights, and she had told me very specifically, she told me not to get out of bed, and of course me being the curious one, and I had gotten out of bed. I remember the light was kind of dancing through the window panes, and I had gone into the second room. I saw money being exchanged, and I was I got really curious. I saw my stepdad and some other guys, and I was hey, that's money, I want some money too. They said something you're gonna have to earn this. I was then hogtied and gang raped And I woke up several hours later. It was really dark at that point. My white nightgown was soaked in blood, and I think that they had untied me at some point, but I literally passed out in my own blood, and it was to the point that it was like congealed. It was congealed blood at that point, because like normally when you bleed, you know, it's not tacky, but the blood was very, very tacky. It was all through my hair, and I knew that my mom couldn't handle this. I had to protect her, so I ended up taking off my nightgown, and I had this system of rolling up the underwear with like the nightgown, and I had hid it underneath my bed. And there are images of me going to the metal trash can on the. It wasn't exactly paved. It was like basically like a rocked driveway, and I was like having to step over the rocks, and I was like constantly throwing away like nightgowns and like underwear inside the trash can when I saw them. And my mom knew that something horrible was happening to me because I was having to wear sanitary pads at this point, and the blood and my stomach aches were so bad that I couldn't play. Like, I wasn't playing anymore. I became very withdrawn. They used to put me up against the wall and like light my feet on fire with like cigarettes and stuff, and just like let me scream and scream and scream. I lived off of dog food for a little bit during that time. I have very, very strong images of being in a pedophile ring with like other children, and they were taking my photos with these kids, and they're like, you know, telling me how to position myself and where to touch them, and they were touching me, and there was like all of these like Polaroids being taken. I remember when my mom was in the shower being on top of my stepfather and him being naked and him rubbing himself in me. I know that there was a lot of questions as to where they were getting a lot of money from, because my stepfather had bought like one of those like massive like bed in the bags that were like really popular like during that time, you know. And my mom asked like, where's the one for Mary? And he's like, oh no, like she just doesn't like deserve it. And I remember the one Christmas, he wasn't giving my mom any money for Christmas, and so Clayton had gotten like roughly like $1,000 worth of presents, my mom said, and like I didn't get anything because she didn't have any money, and so the only thing that she could afford at that time was a lollipop. And she's like, you were just so thankful for this like lollipop, and even to this day, like I'm so grateful for small things. And she's like, you know, it didn't even like faze you or like, you know, whatever. And she's like, you were always just so thankful and just so grateful for like everything. I had this angelic person contact. She actually happened to be one of my mom's friends, but she ended up going to the courthouse in Henrietta, and she basically said these two kids are super, super neglected. And she had mentioned the fact that she had suspected that I had been severely abused and raped. And when we were leaving to escape, because my mom obviously didn't want to face jail time, so my her other uncle that lived in San Antonio gave her enough bus money and stuff to get me, her, Clayton, and myself to San Antonio. And what happened was he had attacked my mom, and I got really angry, and I went after him and I bit him. My mom said I looked like a crazy animal. Like, I bit him so hard I actually drew blood, and I was just like running around the house with like blood like coming out of my mouth. There was like this open gaping wound on his arm, and I think it was just kind of like my own way of getting revenge, because I had seen him rape my mom. Like, moving to San Antonio, I was 4, and things got really complicated there. I was living with my great uncle, and that was when I knew that at 4 I was pretty helpless. I always saw myself as being like really big and like really like independent and stuff. And, you know, when the beatings would get so bad, you know, I would like pack up my little brother and like, you know, I'd go on all of these adventures. And I always thought of myself as being super brave and like I can handle it, and like murder kind of puts things into perspective. My uncle had I don't remember who she was. She was really pretty though. He had a bad temper, really bad temper, and he had bashed her head up against the clawfoot tub while she was in the tub, and I really failed to save her life. I was trying really hard to find towels or something to stop the bleeding, because it was a really, really bad head wound, and like kind of looked like mashed spaghetti. I didn't really know what I was looking at, but it was actually like brain matter that I was like looking at, and like he had like smashed it so bad. And I was 4. I never saw blood like that before in my life. I was looking at her and I was screaming, and the blood was like all over my hands. It was in my nail beds. It was just everywhere. She called me over and she's like, Mary, like, come here. And I was like, no, I've got to help you. And she's like, sweetie, I don't want to die here alone. I need you to like be with me so I can go to heaven. And I said, I'm too little. I don't know what to do. And she's like, I just need you to pray. And so I remember praying with her. And a few minutes later, there were these cops that were there. There was one in the tub with, like, around the tub with her. There were 2 cops that were, like, helping her get out of the tub. I lost track of Clayton during this moment. I don't know where he was or like what he was doing. They had wrapped her body up in like a plastic bag, and I was just standing there like twisting my nightgown like around and down and up and down, and I didn't know what was happening. And then my mom had come home and she's like, what did Mary get into? And they're like, oh, she just got into hair dye. And like and I was like, I didn't know how to say that it was blood. I was too afraid. I was afraid of like shaking my mom's world. She wasn't handling things well, and so I just kind of let it go because, you know, moms can only handle so much, you know, and I didn't want to put that on her. It was shortly thereafter the murder that I was like asking, like I became suicidal, like because I knew that like when you died, like you went to heaven and like heaven meant something better. And I think my mom got to the point that she understood that she was probably going to end up in jail if she kept us. And so it doesn't exist anymore. It was called Adoption Services Associates. Clayton and I were like the very first kids to go through Adoption Services Associates that was formerly owned by Linda Soufflet. And I remember that they had brought like all of this paperwork to my mom, and she was like signing it, and I was trying to get attention, and she's like, no, like you need to be quiet, like I'm trying to sign this stuff. It was around March-ish. She was sitting with me on the steps of our house. She was telling me that I was going to go away for like a really long time and that I wasn't going to see her for a very long time. And I made the promise to her. I said, I'm going to come back and find you. Clayton and I were ushered into a very nice sports car. He was very excited because he loved car rides. And I don't think at 2.5 he understood like what was going on. I knew something serious was happening, but I didn't quite understand. I knew that it was something serious because when she used to talk to me like that, I knew that it was something big, but I didn't understand like how big it was. And I remember watching her because like she had like the racing stripes. Linda Soufflet had like the racing stripes in the back of her car, and I remember watching her through the racing stripes, and I'm just like, it's so unfair, like this is so unfair, like what's happening. And like I was really sad. And then we were taken to a temporary foster home, and I was so mad at the girl because I was like, Clayton's a big boy, like you can like bathe him in the bathtub, like it's not like a huge thing. And I kind of wish I had told her that, you know, people had tried to drown me in the bathtub to kill me. I kept a lot of stuff. So Gail and Peter Ruffing adopted us on Mother's Day. I believe it was 1985. I believe it was Mother's Day when the paperwork finally went through. And my brother and I, we were baptized at the Good Shepherd Lutheran Church in Ridgewood, New Jersey, because that's where she was from. And she was a very excellent teacher. She has won awards for her teaching. She taught high school science. She had quit teaching when she knew that she was going to adopt. They had been struggling for infertility for a very long time. You know, they're thinking like, oh, these kids just came from poverty. It wasn't until the doctor's office that he basically explained to her, your daughter's pelvic flooring is basically non-existent. And they later found out that my brother would be mentally challenged because there was bone where brain was supposed to be. I never really attached. I mean, they did do some pretty heinous things too. It wasn't like they were perfect. I mean, they beat me with boards a couple of times. I was dealing with bulimia and they forced me to eat my own vomit. Like, it wasn't picture perfect either, but I know that they tried. But like, I was having severe nightmares that I wasn't telling anybody about. I had eating disorders. I was already suicidal. On June the 6th of 1992, my very last day of 5th grade, I came home to every single thing that I had in my possession packed. I had pictures of me cut out from the walls. They kept every single one of my photos. And they said, okay, congratulations, you're no longer officially a part of the Ruffing family, and you are going to be dropped off at an airport, and you're going to be shipped back to Texas with the original agency. We're not paying for anything because this is the worst $10,000 investment that we've ever made. Good luck to you, and bye and ciao. So that's exactly what happened. They dropped me off, and I lost a mom, a dad, my brother, who I had never been separated from up until this point. And yeah, I was dealing with a little bit of violence, but nothing that would have been too alarming. Like, I mean, I wasn't setting houses on fire. I wasn't chronically like stealing anything outrageous. I wasn't into drugs. I wasn't promiscuous at this point. I was just not doing schoolwork, lying about stupid crap, and just basically trying to figure out this whole thing called life. But there wasn't really anything that I did that was like super, super bad. I just wasn't attached, and they were thinking that I was going to become some serial killer because I wasn't attached. I then was very frustrated because I thought because I was going back to San Antonio that I was going back with my biological mom, and it turned out that that was not the case, that I was actually going to the group home, and there was no questions asked about that. And I was a kid. There was a family that was interested in me, and I told my caseworker, I said, I do not want to be adopted by these people. And she said, why? I said, because if the Ruffings were having a hard time paying $150,000 a year for my psychiatry bills, I said, this family that you're trying to pawn me off for free obviously isn't going to do it. And I said, I'm never going to become healed. And I said, you're doing me a huge disservice. And I said this to my caseworker at the age of 11 and a half. And of course, they didn't listen to me because it was costing them a huge amount of money keeping me in the group home, because they were paying for that and not the Ruffings. And so then I got adopted into a cult family. And the agency waived the $10,500 agency fee because they were like, well, it's going to cost us more than that to keep her in the group home, and this family wants her, and no one else is going to adopt an 11-year-old who is dealing with chronic weird lying and non-attachment disorders, so we're just going to give her to them. And I dealt with exorcisms. I dealt with solitary isolation for 2 years. I was a homeschooler, and I became imprisoned in that family. Very good on the outside. I mean, they were really great on the outside. Like, they did prison ministry. They went to Brazil to be missionaries. They hated me, and they said that to me. They said, when we first saw you, like, we didn't even like you. We just adopted you because it was God's will for us to adopt you, but we didn't even like you. And they told me that their biggest plan for me was to get AIDS, so that way I could die, and that I would become closer to God when I got AIDS. And they were telling me that when I became pregnant, that they were going to take my children away from me because they didn't think that I was deserving of children, and they were looking at getting me a lobotomy, and they were looking into that. And then they were pretty ticked off about the fact that that wasn't really a possibility anymore, and that they wished that I had been born sooner because they would have lobotomized me. The spiritual abuse, the writing exercises were horrible. They would ask me questions like, Marianne, why do you hate school? Like, why do you hate being homeschooled? And I was like, because I would say something like, I don't have friends here, and like, I feel like I'm in prison. And they're like, well, you didn't really have friends when you were with the Ruffing, so you're a liar. So if you're a liar, that means that you're a God hater. So are you a God hater? And until I would write, yes, I'm a God hater, like, that part would stop, but this would go on for hours. This went on for like 3.5 years. And then when it was all said and done, she picked up like probably about 2,000 worth of sheets, and she said, this is the material I'm going to use to take away your kids. I was 11 and a half. When I was 18, I went back to live with my biological mom. The agency pulled a lot of strings, and I was able to reconnect with her, and I found out a lot of this stuff. And then seeing the kind of life that my mother lived, I decided that I wanted to fully attach to this cult family because I felt like if I did that, that I would be closer to God. They kidnapped my kids through extortion, immigration extortion. My husband had come over from England, married me at 19. We were madly in love. We planned our family. My kids were planned. I didn't have kids before wedlock. And after 9/11 happened, immigration became really hard, and so my parents forced us to move back with them. And he had gotten involved in some because of some of the stuff that he had gone through as a kid. I didn't even know that he was on, honestly. And my brother was supposed to take my kids temporarily, and then they basically told my husband, if you don't sign this, we're going to stop your sponsorship and you're going to get deported anyway, so can you just do us this favor, because she doesn't really deserve these kids anyway, and we don't really love her enough to give her the chance to parent. That was really hard going through that. It took me a really long time to heal from that because they took both of them. They used the fact that I have a lot of empathy for people because my second daughter, they promised the family my kid before I even made the decision to do it. And they made me sign papers, and I don't even remember what I signed because I was under medication. And they told the family, they were like, well, we're just going to tell her that we already picked you guys out and she's just going to say yes because we know how she is. I left the United States after that. Shortly after, my boss knew of this Canadian person, and I ended up marrying somebody that was 15 years older than me. And of course, I thought that I was fine until I got a call from my biological grandmother saying, I think it's time that you know that you were trafficked at the age of 3 and that you had been born out of incest. And she's like, I think you can handle it now. I didn't handle it so good. I'm sorry. I mean, that's the truth. I didn't handle it very well. It changed me somehow. And I guess because I was mourning so much, and so much of it made sense, and as to why I wasn't attached to any of my families. The loss and the grief and the anger that I had, but then I made a conscious decision to forgive. I finally kind of put the pieces of my life back together. It took me a long time. It took me 18 years of therapy and PTSD rehab and a whole bunch of other stuff, but I made the decision. That I was going to heal my trafficker, and that I was praying for him. I specifically asked my grandmother for a picture of him so that way I could have him up on my wall, and that every time I passed by I would pray for him and just pray for him and just pray for him until the hate and the anger and everything subsided. I use train therapy a lot. I'm a huge advocate for that. For 6 months I studied Holocaust survivors because I didn't really know of anybody that had survived such horrific things like this and actually lived to tell the tale and actually healed and stuff. So I studied Holocaust survivors for a very long time, and then I did surrogacy. I healed enough. I got to do surrogacy. I became a surrogate in 2018, and so infertile couple ended up getting a beautiful baby, and I'm really proud of that. And I wrote my book, Elevators of My Life, and that got an award. I wrote that in 4 days, so I was super impressed with that. And I got married, and I became a certified life coach, certified counselor. So it all worked out in the end. I mean, it's very beautiful to see, what forgiveness does. But yeah, that's my story.